Dr. Bob Bianchi, critical art historian. Today we're looking at a stela. Stela is derived from the Greek and Latin, which means a monument, generally of stone, could be of wood. They're taller than they are wide, and they are used in Egypt for two purposes. Number one, they are used to commemorate deeds of Pharaoh, which he thought were worth recording for posterity. And secondly, as here, they were funerary monuments used to commemorate the deceased. This stela was created during the so-called Coptic period in ancient Egypt. The adjective Coptic derives from the Greek noun Aegyptos, which is the Greek word for Egypt, and it is used by scholars universally to explain and define that period of ancient Egypt history when the native Egyptian population converted to Christianity. So Coptic is the early Christian period. And like most Egyptian stela, this particular one was quarried, brought to a workshop, and there dressed and prepared for purchase by the friends, the relatives, or the heirs of the individual that was dead. Now, there are two important things for us to recognize about this particular stela, which generally passes over everybody's head. And that is, after the stela was dressed, that is, worked down from the quarried block, smoothed to its general shape, and then the face was very, very carefully smoothed. The artisan responsible for the decoration very, very meticulously must have drawn this delicate pattern onto the surface and then began to drill the negative space out so that when he was finished, the entire stela had a lace-like effect. Now, if we take a pane of glass and run it over the surface of the stela, you see that every single raised surface is on the same plane. And that took a great deal of pain, a great deal of labor, a great deal of energy, and a great deal of planning. Because the result is imagery which conforms to the frontal plane. There is no image that projects forward, there's no image that goes back. Dedicated, hard work, labor intensive over a long period of time. Now, the second point that I'd like to emphasize in terms of this stela is that you see it is a little bit dirty, especially in these areas over here. And many of my colleagues, some collectors, some museum curators, think that that distracts from the visual appearance. And so some individuals have this deplorable habit of trying to make these monuments look a little bit more attractive, a little bit more cleanly. And so they go and they try to clean this up, get rid of the dirt, so to speak. And I think that that is a very, very destructive act and one should be avoided. Because all of this debris that you see here, all of this accumulation, is part and parcel of the history of this particular object. It's part of its biological heritage. And by removing it, we're removing part of the past. And it's quite possible, with advances that are being made in science on a day-to-day basis, that it might be possible to analyze some of this debris. And that might give us an idea about how the environment in which this stela was erected changed over time. So I would urge everyone to, if you collect art, if you admire art, do not clean it because you are erasing one or more chapters of the object's autobiography. Now, this particular stela is divided into three horizontal zones. Each of those zones is identified as a register, a horizontal row, if you will. And you can quite clearly see how that works. We have a dividing line over here, We have a dividing line over here. We have a zone, a zone, a zone. And what we're basically looking at, and we'll see this in detail very, very shortly, is on a ground line, we're going to be able to look at architectural elements like a floral column to the left and right, and a triangular pediment at the top, in the middle of which is a figure. And then what we call the epitaph from the tombstone is down here at the bottom. Let's now look at each of these individual elements. The top register represents the triangular pediment of the temple, and in the tympanum, or the triangular space within the triangle, is a shell motif. If you look closely at the second register, it contains the two floral columns supporting the pediment from the facade of the temple. The central image is a bird. If you look very carefully, the bird is wearing a necklace, suspended from which is a Nefer sign. And then there are these two curious images to the left and right of the Nefer sign that have been interpreted as either clover leaves or perhaps stylized Ankh signs. The stela is designed to represent an Egyptian temple, as we've just seen. We're able to identify the floral capitals, the pediment. Here's the shell on the inside with the bird in the middle. The ornithological identification of the bird is a little bit difficult, but it is generally assumed that this is a dove that represents the soul of the deceased. And the dove has around its neck that Nefer sign, which is the Egyptian hieroglyph. It can be translated many, many ways in English, but one of the more compelling translations would be perfect. So if this represents the soul of the deceased, the Nefer sign suggests that the soul is perfect. That makes legitimate sense because we have the perfect Christian in paradise. And the Nefer sign is flanked by what might be two inverted Ankh signs, again appropriated from the pagan pharaonic tradition, to indicate that this soul is alive in Christian paradise. And Christian paradise is again suggested by the profusion of floral ornaments that we see on this particular stela. And we can see the braided band up here, we can see these floral elements here, and even the floral columns themselves. So it is a representation of the deceased, the soul of the deceased as a bird, as a dove, in paradise, appointed with the Egyptian hieroglyph for Nefer, the perfect soul, suggesting that this person's soul will live forever in paradise by what might be the stylized Ankh signs on either side of the Nefer sign proper. The third register, or the bottom of the relief, contains an inscription in Greek in 3 lines, which we will now discuss. 3 lines of Greek contain an epithet for the deceased. The first line can be read eis theos, and that is the Greek phrase in the early Christian period referring to God as the one God, eis theos. The second line is one word, o boethys, which translates something on the order of the helper, the assistant. And then the third line contains the name of the deceased, based on one of the writers of the Gospels, Paul, because we read in Greek Paulus. So the epithet translates one God, the helper, on behalf of the deceased Paul. And what's interesting about this stela, as is interesting about most Egyptian stela, is that we assume it was rack made. And by that I mean all of this was very, very beautifully done at the top. And then very, very crudely, if that's the right word, the bottom was left empty. And when the heirs or the relatives or the friends of the deceased acquired this, they decided to personalize it, and they did that by having the inscription here. And I think you can see, if you have a critical eye, that the care with which the decoration was carved is not the same hand as the inscription of the epitaph that you see here. So we can therefore suggest that this was a rack-made piece. People went to the studio. That's the stele that I want to buy. And then we're going to personalize it by adding this inscription in the bottom. And the third register, the bottom register, seems to have been purposely left blank for that specific purpose, so that the epithet could be added later on. And now we want to add one final thought to our discussion. And that is, ancient Egyptian objects were often painted. And in this particular example, you can see the Nefersign is black. There are some details of red along the architecture. And in Egypt, color is symbolic. And the symbolism begins with the material from which the stela is made. Now, this stela is made of limestone. Limestone is white. And in ancient Egyptian tradition, white stands for purity and cleanliness. And that's appropriate in a funerary context because we want the deceased to live in a clean, pure state. And then the red is added because in ancient Egyptian tradition, red is a color that's associated with rebirth. And so in a Christian sense, if the soul is living forever in Christian paradise, the soul is in a sense reborn. So the red is appropriate for articulating that particular concern. And the black that you see here in ancient Egypt is itself a resurrection color. It is the color of Osiris on occasion. It is the color of the rich agricultural soil. So the black implies the resurrection of the deceased in the Christian hereafter. Now, don't be fooled into thinking that the added color, black and red, obscure the color of the limestone, because Egyptian color symbolism can be compared to a very, very, very delicious layer cake. And it is the combination of layers that make the cake so scrumptiously delicious. So what we have here is a layer cake. We have the white that symbolizes one aspect. We have the red that symbolizes a second. We have the black that symbolizes a third. And when you put these layers together, it becomes a nuanced symbolic explosion referring to the state of the deceased in the hereafter. Dr. Bob.